So one of my big takeaways is if I could reincarnate myself, I'd be able to spin my mustache like Jay Healy in that devilish way that he does. It's very good, very theatrical. I had been participating in this conference and sharing my suggestions forward for half a decade. And I concur with Laura that I think this is one of the richest conferences we've had yet. And I'd like to acknowledge and thank Judith Rodin and Alex Niejelow for their generous support for this conference. We're very fortunate to have them as our partners in it, and I think it coincides with the maturation of this dialogue. I'm an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations focused on technology, innovation, and U.S. foreign policy. So I'm invited to lots of these discussions. I participate in many of them, and I can honestly say, and I think dispassionately say, that this event at Columbia, the Digital Futures Conference, is among the best and most dynamic and richest discussions I think occurs on an annual basis in the United States, and so I'm very privileged to be part of it. If I were to summarize over the past 5 years, I would give you this thesis, and I apologize in advance because it's a very pessimistic thesis. I think we have observed from year to year the progressive march to what I would call a dark tomorrow in our technology world. Jay Healy gave a very eloquent summation of it earlier in one of the panels. Each year we think we've kind of hit a new acme, a high watermark of threat and risk. And it's always surpassed by some series of spectacular events, and it seems to happen now with great predictability and regularity on an annual basis. I think we see this deterioration in the environment in 5 different areas. The first would be cybercrime. There has been, to my knowledge, no meaningful abatement or reduction in the number of cybercrime incidents, in their severity, and most importantly, in their sophistication. The attackers are becoming increasingly ingenious, and offense continues to have a systemic advantage over defense. The one bright spot, which was noted a few years ago, was the discussion between President Obama and President Xi in Sunnyvale, where there was ostensibly an agreement that systemic Chinese hacking of our intellectual property would diminish or cease. And cybersecurity experts noted that in the following months there was in fact a decrease in activity, but the people who I speak to who track this say that that has resumed, and that's not been a meaningful deterioration or aberration in the pattern that continues. Secondly, in cyber conflict, year after year, we've seen one spectacular event after another. Ukraine, WannaCry, Stuxnet, the Maria event, and then most dramatically, from my perspective, the events of 2016, direct intervention into the very mechanics of American democracy. We have spoken significantly about the fragmentation of the internet. That trend has not abated. China has, year after year, refined and perfected its great firewall. Just within recent days, Russia has articulated and announced its intent to build its own version of the great firewall under this theme or guise of internet sovereignty. But we continue to see what Eric Schmidt referred to a few years ago, and my colleague Scott Malcolmson refers to as the Splinter Net. I've written about it myself. I had to have a quarrel with the editor of The Atlantic, who wrote the headline, "The End of the Internet." I said, could you at least put a question mark after that? Because it's not a decisive fact, but it seems to be progressively deteriorating. And this vision we had of an open, unified global network is under severe and progressive threat. And I think there are 2 additional trends that we've not discussed with the depth we have in prior years, which are now part of, arguably, the threat matrix. They are the weaponization of social media. I think it's an extraordinary phenomenon. I focused a lot of my work at the Council on trying to understand it, who the threat actors are, how it's perpetrated, what are the vulnerabilities in the social network platforms that make it possible. At the very beginning of this whole episode with Facebook in the 2016 election, they said that 12 million users had been had absorbed or viewed Russian-generated content. That number has gone up progressively. It's at now 126 million. And as the author Roger McNamee has observed, the author of Zucht, Facing the Catastrophe of Facebook, he was an investor in Facebook, I think this number is correct, there were 137 million people who voted in the 2016 election, and 126 million of them had exposure to this Russian-generated content. Put that into context of how the victor in the presidential campaign won by 77,700 votes combined in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. It's hard to doubt that social media had an influence in the most profound exercise of American democracy, our ability to elect a president. And finally, the last issue, which had not emerged in prior conversations to the degree it could or should, but did come up today, and I want to applaud Laura for bringing it to our collective attention, is the advent of 5G. We are on the precipice of a new central nervous system of the internet, a central nervous system for the global economy, a central nervous system for the Internet of Things that will connect tens and tens of billions of devices. We will have speeds that will go up 200x with essentially zero latency that will theoretically at least facilitate the advent of autonomous vehicles and new industrial processes that we can hardly imagine. An extraordinary new paradigm of the internet. Yet we are hurtling into this future with a completely irresponsible attention to the security of that network. As the former FCC chairman Tom Wheeler has argued, I think very persuasively, if the internet of tomorrow, if 5G is so important, why isn't it secure? It's extraordinary that we have such a paucity of serious discussion about the security, infrastructure and architecture of 5G, and it's something that is missing in this conversation, and that I hope we will continue to discuss in the Digital Futures Conference, I hope, for the next half decade. Thank you.